Great. Good morning. Welcome to this Resolution Foundation event, Tackling the Scourge of Modern Britain. I'm Mike Brewer, the Deputy Chief Executive here at the Foundation, and you're very welcome online or in our auditorium to discuss child poverty, what has happened, what might happen, and what should be in the government strategy that we're promised later this year. For today's discussion, I'm joined by Alex Clegg, an economist at Resolution Foundation, by Kerry Oppenheim, who does many things, but chiefly is the early childhood lead at the Nuffield Foundation, and Aaron Reeves, Professor of Sociology at the London School of Economics. The plan for this morning is that Alex will share the key findings from today's report, which you can get from our website if you want to read along with him, and then we'll have a response from Kerry and then Aaron, and then plenty of time for discussion and comments. We'll be using Slido for questions, so if you go to Slido, the code is child poverty. If you're in the room, you can stick your hand up or use Slido if you're feeling socially awkward. Before we start, let me say something about the political and fiscal context in which we're in. The world is obviously changing very quickly at the moment. We could be at the start of a profound change to the NATO alliance, which could have very dramatic consequences for Europe as a whole, and more parochially for our own foreign and defence policy. I think yesterday's announcement by the Prime Minister was just a glimpse of that, going from 2.3 to 2.5% of GDP on defence is a really tiny change, £6 billion. It's nothing, but much more important, I think, was a statement that defence spending, he'd like it to reach 3% in the following Parliament, and there seems to be widespread political consensus for that too. So with all that going on, we did wonder why we were holding today's event and launching a report where, spoiler alert, the punchline is going to be that seriously tackling child poverty is also going to require serious resources. Well, I think there are two reasons why we're going ahead. The first one, to borrow from a colleague of mine, is that the UK is a rich country and we can afford both to defend ourselves and to ensure that children don't grow up in poverty and disadvantage. And a twist on that will be also to realise that if we don't defend ourselves, then we might not be a rich country for much longer, given the state of the world. But also, if we don't ensure our children aren't growing up in poverty and disadvantage, then what's the point of being a rich country at all? But of course, I'm sure we will want to discuss the very different fiscal and political circumstances the government finds itself in today, compared to just 2 or 3 months ago when we started writing this report. But the second reason we're doing today is that I think what we're really mainly doing is just echoing the government's words back to themselves. It was only 5 months ago the government published its document on the child poverty strategy, and it said, "Poverty scars the lives and life chances of our children. It is shameful that child poverty has increased by 700,000 since 2010. And that's our starting point for today. So I expect I will accidentally use the phrase tough choices at some point to describe the dilemmas facing those in government right now. Of course, there are tough choices being made every day by mothers and fathers trying to bring their children up on inadequate incomes. And that's why we are here this morning. So to kick us off, Alex, you will talk us through the key findings of this morning's report.
Thank you. Hello everyone, welcome. Nice to see so many people. So as Mike said, the government has stated its ambitions to reduce child poverty. And the first thing to say is that the ambitions are very welcome. One of the main reasons for this is that the record of the UK on child poverty is pretty terrible. When we compare ourselves to other countries, looking at child poverty before housing costs, there's only 5 countries in Europe who are currently worse than us. And when we look at child poverty after housing costs, this is a slightly different measure from what tends to be used in UK statistics. But on this measure, only Greece is worse than us at the moment in terms of child poverty. So the most recent child poverty data, official data, is from 2022-23. That showed that there are 30% of children living in poverty in the UK. That compares to 16% of pensioners, 18% of working age non-parents. So children are much more likely than adults to be in poverty. Perhaps the most pressing reason for a child poverty strategy now is that since 2022, we project that child poverty has risen to around 31%. And over the next decade, we project it's going to rise quite dramatically. So in the absence of any policy action, and if current economic forecasts hold, child poverty will be around 33% by the end of this Parliament. And We've extended our projections 10 years into the future because the child poverty strategy has been stated that it will cover a 10-year period. And projections that, to this length of time are quite difficult, but if everything stands as it is now, we project that child poverty will be at 36%, which is a record high by 2034. At present, the government hasn't said whether it's minded to have any kind of target for what it wants to achieve with the child poverty strategy. But obviously, the strategy is going to be judged on some kind of measure. And we suggest 3 meaningful bars that the government might want to look at and might want to clear. The first is any kind of reduction relative to the 2024-25 level. And because the projection is for child poverty to rise so steeply over the next 5 years, it's quite conceivable that the government could enact child poverty reducing measures and child poverty could still rise. And we'll show you some scenarios in which that does happen. They clearly can't call that a success. Child poverty has to come down for strategy to be successful. A second bar might be getting below the average of the recent Conservative-led years, 2010 to 2024. That would be below around 29% of children in poverty, so a 2 percentage point reduction. Would allow the government to say their record is better than their predecessors. And a stretch goal would be achieving the lowest poverty rate since the 1980s, which would be below 27% of children in poverty. The last time we saw these levels was in 2011, when the coalition government came, or just after the coalition government came into power, and in 2020 during the pandemic year when some of the statistics went a bit haywire. But achieving this level would allow the government to say there's a real break with the past sort of 4 decades of child poverty levels. So what could the government do to achieve some of these to surpass some of these barriers? We look at 3 areas in the report. So parental employment, reducing housing costs, and income support for families with children. The government is clearly going to want to look at parental employment as part of the child poverty strategy. Work is a very effective way for for families in poverty to move out of poverty, and critically, it would be a revenue raiser for the government rather than requiring extra spending. And it's illustrative to look at the record of parental employment over the last couple of decades, in which there's been quite a lot of success. So lone parent employment went from around 49% in 2000 to 66% in 2022. The employment rate for mothers in couples went from 70 to 77% in the same time, with a big increase in those working full-time. And that's a reassuring thing that's happened, but it's important to be realistic about what that means. There's a couple of reasons why we might not expect that success to be repeatable. One is that because of the success, there's just less road to travel in terms of moving more parents into work. And it's also shifted the makeup of families in poverty, the economic makeup. Sorry, that's broken. There we go. So families in poverty are now much more likely to be in work. So if you're looking at the blue and the green areas here, that's family types in poverty. In 2000, 49% of them were in work. By 2022, that's 70% of families in poverty have at least one adult in work. There's still 1.3 million children living in households who are in poverty who are not working. That's the represented by the red and the pink area here. So there is still some progress to be made, but it's just important to be realistic about what could happen. So we model a scenario where the lone parent employment rate increases by around 5 percentage points between 2024 and 2034. This wouldn't be quite as quickly as it increased over the last 20 years, but it's faster than it increases in the OBR projections, for example. And yeah, the same thing for couples with children, their employment rate up 2 percentage points. The government also has big ambitions on housing. They've promised to build 1.5 million homes by the end of the Parliament and invest heavily in social housing. There's a lot of debate about how achievable this is, but we give some benefit of the doubt and look at if if that can be achieved, that would have some impact on private rents. So to come up with a reasonable, optimistic solution, we also model private rents at around 3.5% lower than their projected level by the end of the Parliament to represent this. And this would have these optimistic scenarios would have some impact on child poverty. Both of them together would represent around 120,000 children moving out of poverty by the end of the Parliament, which is clearly a move in the right direction. But these moves in isolation wouldn't be enough to stop poverty rising over the Parliament. So instead of rising from around 31% now to 33% by the end of the Parliament, we project that poverty would rise to around 32% by the end of the Parliament. So it wouldn't clear that first bar of poverty reducing versus 2024. Our conclusion from this is that if the government really wants to make a meaningful reduction in child poverty, it has to invest in increasing income support for families with children. And I don't think many people in the room will be surprised when I say that our priority for this would be the 2-child limit. There's not any policies that are such a big driver of child poverty. When we look at child poverty by family size, you can see that larger families are much more likely to be in poverty than families with 1 or 2 children. Our projection is that 50%, this is a hard sentence, 50% of children in families with 3 or more children will be in poverty by the end of the Parliament under current policies. So we model scrapping the 2-child limit from this year, and we include scrapping the benefit cap along with it, just so that the full impact of removing the 2-child limit is felt. We don't leave some families to just simply run up into the benefit cap. The impact of this is a big reduction in child poverty. So it will be worth around 500,000 fewer children in poverty by 2029-30. So clearly the biggest thing that you can do and the most cost-effective thing that you can do. But child poverty isn't just about large families. So we look at a few more options that an ambitious government might want to consider to bring child poverty down further. First of all, we look at removing the income threshold within free school meals. So at the moment, families on universal credit who earn below £7,400 a year are the only ones eligible for free school meals. If you earn more than that, you're not eligible. So we model removing this earnings threshold. And importantly, this can be done within departmental spending budget, so it wouldn't require extra additional welfare spending. So fiscally, it would be slightly easier for the government to do. This is also quite well targeted in terms of poverty reduction. It would be worth around 100,000 fewer children in poverty. I should say that the lines here are cumulative. We're moving down, we're adding policies on rather than doing one at a time. And that would get us down to closer to that 2011, 2012 low in terms of the child poverty rate. And a very ambitious government might want to go even further, and we look at a couple more policies. First, raising the basic adequacy level of universal credit. It's been well documented that the general adequacy of universal credit is pretty low. We do this targeted at families with children by restoring the family element, which has been being slowly abolished by excluding it from children born after 2017. So children born before 2017 get a higher child element in universal credit. That's being slowly abolished. We model restoring that, removing that age cutoff, and restoring the value of the family element. So it's in real terms worth what it was worth in 2016, which is around £750 per family next year and around £800 by the end of the Parliament. In addition to that, we looked at repegging the local housing allowance to the 30th percentile of local rents. Local housing allowance is currently frozen. That means that the big shortfalls build up between rents and housing support, and it can do quite a lot to push families into quite deep poverty when their incomes just aren't matching their outgoings. The impact of both of these policies together is around another 140,000 children out of poverty. It would get you comfortably to record lows since the 1980s in terms of the poverty rate. And Mike mentioned this at the beginning, of course, we're in very difficult fiscal circumstances, and it goes without saying that all of these policies have a price tag. Oh, sorry, I missed this slide. So we looked at the last 5 years. The child poverty strategy has promised to look at the next 10 years. And the problem with the next 10 years is that after achieving this big reduction in child poverty, the way that we uprate benefits, the conventions that we have for uprating benefits in this country means that child poverty kind of naturally rises because benefit income rises more slowly than earnings, which makes up incomes at the median, meaning the poverty line goes like this, poor families' incomes go like this, and that grows over time. So that risks undoing a lot of the progress that you made. You could conceivably remove the 2-child limit, the benefit cap, and boost free school meals, and by 2034 be back to where we started from in 2024. The only way to avoid this is by linking benefit uprating with average earnings growth instead of prices. That would look like this. So it really flattens out that poverty line, would allow you to bank the successes that you've made so far with all these poverty reducing policies. And what I started to say before is that the fiscal position is difficult. All of these policies have a price tag. So scrapping the 2-child limit and the benefit cap would cost around £4.5 billion in 2029-30. Extending free school meals to all families on universal credit would cost around £1 billion, although you could do this within departmental spending. Restoring the family element and repegging the local housing allowance would cost around £3 billion. So the total package is around £8.5 billion or £7.5 billion in extra welfare spending. It's clearly out of money. It's clearly a difficult fiscal circumstance. There's options here. There's choices that the government could make in terms of doing some or all of this. Just to put some of this into context, we are only partially reversing the austerity cuts here from the last couple of decades. We have about £3 billion of welfare cuts still to roll out, with the rollout of the 2-child limit, with the freeze to the benefit cap and the local housing allowance, and the abolition of the family element. So you've got to think of it in the context of this unrealistic baseline where we've cut the welfare system by so much, the government has banked a lot of those cuts, and there's more still to come. This level of investment would be similar to what Scotland has already done with the Scottish Child Payment and the promise to scrap the 2-child limit in Scotland, and it is not anywhere near the amount of money that New Labour spent on extra family support in the 2000s. That adds up to around 40 billion. Of course, it was very different fiscal times. It was a boom time, employment was growing a lot, so they had a lot more money to spend. But these large amounts of investment in child poverty are not unprecedented. I think we'll get into some of that in the discussion, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Alex. Thank you very much, Alex. Kerry, I said at the beginning you're currently working at the Nuffield Foundation, but another thing, you've done many things in your past. One of them was you were in number 10 in the early 2000s when Tony Blair was pledging to abolish child poverty and the government was coming up with its own child poverty strategy. But anyway, your reflections on what you've heard today, please.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. This is a really powerful and important report, and a very important timing as well. I thought it's just worth reminding ourselves about why child poverty matters, both in relation to social justice and in relation to economic opportunity, but also because we know that poverty and lack of resources impacts on children's health, their development, and their life chances. We also know that income plays a particularly important role in terms of its causal effects, and the work that Kitty Stewart and Keris Cooper did at the LSE on that is really important. And I think the concern is that without action on child poverty, it's going to be very difficult for the current government to achieve, I think, some of the social and economic goals that it has set out for itself. So if I think back about child poverty, the earlier child poverty strategy in the late 1990s and 2000s, and obviously, as everybody said, it's a very different context. But what reduced child poverty over that period? So it was a kind of cluster of mutually reinforcing social and economic policies. A key was increasing employment, the New Deals and other welfare to work policies. It was about making work pay, so that was the minimum wage, but plus tax credits, because minimum wage on its own is not that targeted in relation to child poverty. And then, as has been said, really major increased financial support for families with children, with a sort of raft of tax credits, new benefits for children, extra support for babies, and major support with childcare costs, as well as also maternity and pregnancy. So there was a strong sort of children's agenda in that, underpinned by financial support. And we also saw the expansion of investment in education and skills, childcare and the early years. Feels like a long time ago, doesn't it? While there were fluctuations in the child poverty rate over the period of the last Labour government, there was major progress over the whole period. And I was thinking about this, that I think also when the financial crash came in 2007-8, children were protected from the onslaught of that financial crash when the government was faced with very difficult economic circumstances and decisions. So I feel that we should take hope from that. Actually, if we think about COVID, of course, we also saw that the government had to be very bold in relation to thinking about what to do and how to protect people's living standards, and the universal credit uplift was also very important in protecting not everybody but some families from what would have been much worse. So some of the essential underpinnings of the strategy was a growing economy, favourable economic context, really, really important. Ambition, strong political leadership right at the top, a small group of measures of poverty and targets, so to hold the government itself to account. I think the importance of 3 different measures: absolute, relative and material deprivation plus income. And then a set of targets that were cascaded through government, so each different department had to contribute to thinking about what they could do to reduce child poverty. And then I think it's also important to remember the social exclusion unit, which was focused on groups that particularly face multiple difficulties, so this kind of complex need. There are also, thinking back, I guess, lessons to learn and thinking about what didn't work so well. So I think issues around costs and the drivers of costs for families with children were not sort of integrated, I think, into the child poverty strategy. And I would say that at certain times the government was dependent on the lever that it's easiest to pull in terms of transfers, because transfers, they have the benefit that you can, it's actually easier to deliver them than it is to kind of change a service, which takes longer, or to work with employers to raise employment. So while income transfers are really vital, income is really vital, as I've said, they can also quickly be dismantled. We didn't, for a whole variety of reasons, I think, develop a deep understanding and commitment among the public about the importance of addressing child poverty. And perhaps that's also because it was quite there was a role for local authorities, but it was quite a centralised approach. It's also before some of the major changes in devolution. So there's something about who else you need to have on board. How is this a strategy that we own as a country? So the big question is, how far is this repeatable in the current context? So as you've said really powerfully, Alex, in the report, it reminds us just how much you have to do to stand still, just for child poverty not to go up. It's a very demanding target. And I hear John Hill's from the LSE's sort of words resonating in my mind. It should be a demanding target because we're a rich country, as you say, Mike, at the beginning. But that's not to say that these other measures are not important. They are important. It's really important to know what's going on in relation to absolute poverty as well, and to severe and lasting, not lasting, but severe and persistent poverty. the legacy of the major reductions in in benefits and tax credits over this period, and this shift away from children to pensioners, when you look at the cumulative changes in tax and social security spending, alongside these very substantial reductions in local authority funding on Sure Start and children's services, then followed by COVID and cost of living, parents, children and the services that serve them have really been battered by this period. So we've got a much harder task. There's less money, and we live in a very different world, and particularly the kind of world context in terms of the whole issues around defence really are very challenging. So in terms of the report itself, it's excellent. I thought that in thinking about the way that poverty has changed, you make a powerful case for the fact that we need to think both about employment, but we've already got quite a big increase in employment. So there's and some of the groups who are in work and in poverty have quite a lot of extra needs. And large families, but there's also been this increase in severe and persistent poverty and destitution. So I think one of the things we might discuss about is what do we do about that, especially given the sort of prioritisation that we might need to think about in terms of resources. So I think there's a very powerful case for the abolition of the 2-child limit. There's a huge amount of evidence that Nuffield has funded some of that Aaron has worked on about its effects, as well as in relation to the benefit cap. I like the combination of your more limited. Well, I like all of them if we had enough money to do them, but your first package, your more minimal package, has a really good combination of measures. But judging from the latest Observer article about the thinking of the government, what happens if this is not a priority, or if the government can only give much less money? So I wondered if, and you may see this is not the role to have kind of plan B, if you're in this area, but if there was 1 to 2 billion to spend, what would you spend? What should we be spending it on? Should we be focusing on severe poverty and destitution, or should we be thinking about combined packages of support for parents with extra needs to get into work? Should we be thinking about how we might phase the 2-child limit abolition? So I think that's worth discussing. I'm going to stop very shortly. And I think that the other issue that you don't talk about that much in the report, and you're very upfront about that, is while income is central, it isn't just about income. So I think there's some things, and I say this partly because of having been involved, I think we should think about Sure Start, not to just reinvent it, but we've now got some very good evidence about that it was effective in many areas, and also that it was good value for money. What does a modern labour market look like? What does the good work agenda look like? How do we think about work that pays well and is flexible? What does that mean for those with caring responsibilities and health conditions? And how do we deal with progression? So there's a longer list, but are there some things that we might want to plant the seeds of, which are not only about income, but about other areas of reform? How do we embed child poverty, tackling child poverty and expanding children's opportunities into the infrastructure, into the warp and weft of our services, the way we think about taxes and benefits and our economy? With that, and I'm not saying that we're doing something anyway and we call it being about child poverty, but how do we make it really a fundamental part of how we think about how we sort of deliver services and our tax and benefit system?
Thank you so much, Kerry. That was excellent. We definitely want to return to many of those in the conversation. And then lastly, Erin, you're Professor of Sociology at the LSE, where you sometimes think about the very, very rich, but also sometimes think about the poorest children.
Yeah, trying to think about both.
Yeah.
So I think one of the really important things that comes out of this report, and thank you so much for producing it, particularly at this moment, is I think this headline finding that the most kind of cost-effective way to reducing child poverty is eradicating the two-child limit and the benefit cap. And I think it's crucial to both separate those policies, but also think about them together. I think we sometimes hear the two-child benefit cap, which can be confusing because it lumps these together when really they're separate and we need to pass them. And I think it's fantastic that you've done that. And the reason we need to think about them together is because they, as the report makes really clear, they interact with each other. If we remove the two-child limit without getting rid of the benefit cap, we diminish and mute the impact of that removal. And so seeing that is really important. I wanted to just kind of reflect, I think, on some of the ways in which we might think about those two policies and how they might interact with some of the assumptions that are in the report. For example, we might worry that removing the benefit cap, for example, or even the two-child limit might undermine work incentives and therefore maybe suppress some of the labour market impacts. And actually, from the work that we've done as part of the Benefit Changes and Larger Families project, what we find is that actually isn't true, that the impact of the benefit cap on labour market outcomes, there is some sort of small positive impact on employment, but actually a much larger impact on pushing people into economic inactivity. And part of the reason it does that is because it harms mental health. For the two-child limit, the same kind of story. It doesn't have this really strong impact on labour market outcomes, in part because families in that situation are facing a number of challenges that make it really difficult for them to engage with the labour market. These are parents, when we spoke to them, who want to go back to work, but just find it really difficult to do that right now. And we might think about other ways in which these policies interact with various aspects of spending. For example, when the benefit cap was implemented, one of the hopes was that it would incentivise families to find cheaper accommodation. So what we tried to do was look at the possibility that that could happen. And we looked at every rental property on Zoopla over a given period of time. And what we found is that if you took every capped family in the country, there just aren't enough affordable properties for them to move into to move them out of the benefit cap entirely. In fact, if you took all of them, you could only find houses for around 1 in 6. And that's if you could move them to anywhere away from their local communities, family, friends, schools, etc. So it seems to me that actually the assumptions made in the report are really quite strong in terms of how this is going to play out. I think you would see really large reductions from doing these two big things together, though it does cost some money to do that. And when I think about the costs of inaction, and Carrie is exactly right. We know, we have really good evidence about what happens to poverty or people exposed to poverty over the long run. But I also think about one of the families we spoke to in part of this project. We repeatedly interviewed people over time. And I'm going to speak just very briefly about a family. The head of the family we'll call Lucy. She was a mother of 3. When we first met her, her rent was around £1,400 a month. She was benefit capped and she was losing around £700 a month. Really significant reduction. And when we first met her, she was really proactively looking for new accommodation, but just wasn't able to find anything. In fact, she moved further down the waiting list as we spoke with her. She lived in really poor quality housing and worried that one of her daughters had developed asthma as a result of the extensive mold throughout the property. So Lucy was in a difficult situation. Bad housing, expensive. She remained affected by the cap, and as the cost of living crisis hit, the situation got worse. They started going into debt, using food banks. They even put the lights on much less. And Lucy's mental health suffered as a result. At the beginning of the project, when we spoke to her, she was really actively looking for work. By the end, she was so anxious that she was leaving the house much less often. So when I think about the costs of inaction, I think about families like Lucy's, who really live on the hard edge of these sorts of policy changes. So it doesn't have to be this way, right? We can look even within our own kind of very close neighbours and contexts to see other ways of dealing with this. If we go to Scotland, there's a number of interventions there that are trying to redress these types of policies. There's the Scottish Child Payment, there's the various grants that are offered to in the early years. There's also a commitment to trying to exempt families from the two-child limit. And as the report shows, I think really clearly, there's potentially a growing wedge that's going to emerge between both Scotland and England on this issue, unless the government in Westminster try to do something to ensure that that wedge doesn't emerge, and I really hope that they do. So I'll stop there and look forward to the questions and discussions.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you all. We've got about 35 minutes left. I think we should start with the two-child limit. It's the biggest, it's most effective anti-poverty policy. It's probably that's our main recommendation. But let's start there. There were two questions which I can't bring up both at once, but we'll bring up one. Well, one person asked basically the point Erin has just made, Yvonne's question at the top, about whether the fact that we should link together the calls to end the two-child limit with calls to end the benefit cap, and as Erin has clarified, that's exactly what we do, right? So we think that neither has a role in our social security system, and that both should go at the same time. And as Erin has explained, if you scrapped the two-child limit but kept the benefit cap, then many of those larger families would just crash up into the benefit cap and would not see anything like the game. And we thought of various kind of cunning wheezes to try and sort of pass through the game, but it's just not worth it, right? If you're going to get, if you don't want to, if you believe there shouldn't be a two-child limit, you really shouldn't believe there should be a benefit cap. So that they both should go, both should go together. But then there were, as you may have seen in the weekend papers, there was further speculation of perhaps having a three-child limit rather than a two-child limit, and I think that's an obvious thing for the government to be thinking about, because it might be cheaper than full abolition, but it might also be thinking about it because amongst the public at large, limiting welfare does seem to be very popular. So, I mean, maybe I'll start with Erin. What do you think of the idea of the merits of changing the two-child limit so it becomes a three-child limit? In other words, you get money for your third child, but not for your fourth and subsequent.
Yeah, I think one of the things we would argue, I think, in this context, is that what we want to try and do is actually re-establish the link between need and entitlement. And I think this language is in the report. And what these policies, both the two-child limit and the benefit cap, do is break that link. And I think that if we want a social security system that's built on these kinds of principles, it's actually really important to re-establish that. And I think that the three-child limit still, unfortunately, I think falls short of that goal for me. So I can certainly see from a sort of fiscal point of view, it maybe makes some sense. But I think as the report also makes clear, the financial gains of doing that are not really large compared to eradicating it entirely, because this is actually a really effective, efficient way of sort of supporting these low-income families. So for me, it wouldn't be the thing that I would sort of do, but I can see why people might reflect on it in this context and consider it. But for me, it's important that we try to re-establish that link.
Thank you. Yes, and I found the question asked by the audience, which was very relevant to this. Alex, well, can you just spell out exactly what we put in the report about the cost and the effectiveness of a three-child limit? Yeah.
So I think we echo the sentiment of in the ideal social security system, that principle is very, very important. We did cost this up after the story at the weekend, and the cost and the anti-poverty impact is about 2/3 of scrapping the policy entirely, which is obviously slightly easier fiscally. I don't think it does a lot to make the difference in terms of like whether you can do this or not. I think we should be clear, if a three-child limit was the only option, if it's either that or keeping the two-child limit, it's clearly a very effective way of reducing poverty. It doesn't get at the principles of what we have with this policy, but it does a chunk of.
Great, thank you. I'll just maybe now pause now in case there are any questions from the audience, particularly on the two-child limit. We'll come back to other things later on. We'll take two. So Ruth and then the gentleman over there.
Just on
if you could use the microphone and say who you are.
Yeah, Ruth Lister, House of Lords. The other thing that was floated at the weekend was that the government are thinking about, or the Child Poverty Task Force are thinking about free breakfast rather than the two-child limit as the answer, which seems to me kind of pretty limited. But have you done any work? And also, I mean, they're not at present are willing to consider free school meal option that you're proposing, which is pretty limited, really, because it still limits it to those on universal credit. So I just wondered whether you'd done any work around breakfast, because they are being presented as the answer at present. And I did, while I'm on that, I wondered why you felt that free school meals could be taken out of departmental budgets and other costs couldn't.
Okay, thank you. And there's a gentleman with speak hand up again.
Hi, Thomas Wilson from Greater London Authority. Yeah, I mean, one thing I'd just say about 3-child limit is politically it does seem like strange, right? Because you'd kind of be getting it from both directions. You know, if you scrap it, you kind of get the plaudits for scrapping it. If you don't scrap it, then you can kind of rely on that public opinion. If you go 3-child limit, you kind of get it from both. So it does seem like a bit of a strange system from that perspective. Just to talk a little bit about benefit cap, because I appreciate it's useful to kind of think about these two things together, particularly in London, by the way, where a lot of people are capped. I'm quite interested in how organisations are talking about the benefit cap. Does seem to be shifting a bit. You know, before there were a lot of people talking about scrapping it. There does now seem to be kind of evolutions in how people are looking at the benefit cap. I've seen proposals to kind of re-uprate it, kind of make it higher. Also, some proposals, I think, from JRF about introducing some kind of backstop that would sit behind the benefit cap so that people, you know, it kind of like tapered. I'm interested in how the panel or how this report maybe looked at the benefit cap in terms of different options for adjusting it versus just getting rid of it entirely, similar to how we're talking about adjustments to the 2-child limit.
Thank you, that's great. Yeah, I mean, one of the main reason why the benefit cap is contributing to that rise in child poverty is that it's frozen in nominal terms. I mean, even if you if you think there should be some sort of cap on how much families should get in welfare, and I'm not sure I do, but if you did think there was a cap, then you would like to think that cap would go up at least in line with inflation. Whereas as it stands, it's fixed in nominal terms, so the cap is becoming tighter and tighter in real terms every year. Now, there was one year in the cost of living crisis when Jeremy Hunt did put it up in line with inflation, but that was the one increase it's ever had since being introduced. And in fact, it was also cut once massively under George Osborne. Erin, do you have anything to add on the?
Yeah, I mean, all of these, I think, policies. Again, with the benefit cap, it's not a really large number of families relatively. I mean, it's large and since there's a large, it's a large number of people, but relative to some of these other policies, it's not huge. So to me, I think, and the cost of like addressing this, but really deep poverty for those families affected by it, is really not large. And so for me, tinkering is perhaps not the right solution. I could maybe understand that with some of these other contexts, other policies where, fiscally they're much larger pools. I think it really comes down to whether you accept that there should be some upper limit. The other thing to say about the benefit cap that I think is really important and interacts with what you're laying out is how it plays out with the local housing allowance. Because actually there are large parts of the country where the benefit cap doesn't really even kick in because the local housing allowance is already really low, because a large part of why people are affected by the benefit cap in the first place is rents. And so, if you wanted to sort of think about ways of adjusting this or way that it interacts, I think also reflecting on how it connects with local housing allowance is also really important.
Thanks. And then we should go to Ruth's points. Kerry, do you want to start? The idea, of course, that breakfast clubs can compensate for £4.5 billion of spending is slightly ridiculous. So yes, there's.
Yes, and I'd say not persuasive. Breakfast clubs are a good idea and important in their own right, but it's not the solution to child poverty. So, and I think it's interesting thinking about it in comparison with the school meals proposal, which is more comprehensive and I think an important plank, because it's also thinking about all the issues around food poverty and food insecurity. And I like the fact that you've got a kind of combination of income, employment, and sort of benefits in kind measures. And I think, and we also know from the research that Nuffield and others have funded on school meals that it's it's both a poverty relieving kind of measure, but also there's some other outcomes in terms of children's concentration, cognitive gains, although that was done on universal free school meals. But so, you know, and so it feels like there's some other gains there, and nutrition, obviously, that are really valuable. I don't know about the question about Dell rather than Amy and Dell. So that would be useful to know.
Yeah, I mean, we were being a little bit cheeky, really, in just saying that Department for Education ought to find the money for free
Yes.
school meals. But given everything we know about how children learn better when they're properly fed, so that was a little bit of treasury brain, perhaps. Whereas the extra spending that we call for would come to DWP.
Yeah. I think it's worth making a technical point on free school meals as well, is that free school meals are classed as income in the poverty data, and the government has said that it wants to focus on relative poverty after housing costs as its main measure, with a look at deep poverty as well. They haven't quite outlined exactly how they're going to look at deep poverty, but in terms of showing the success, free school meals is counted as income, and it's worth about £500 per child at the moment. So just technically, in terms of bringing down the poverty rate, although you could argue that free school meals and breakfast clubs are doing a similar thing, one of them would show in the statistics and one of them wouldn't.
Thank you. Okay, I want to change topic slightly now and look at the idea the government could beat the forecast, which. And in your report, Alex, we have an optimistic employment scenario, but there's a question that's relevant, a question someone asked which is relevant to this, so that you don't need to address it exactly. Well, the question is pointing out the government has done last government did a great deal to expand childcare for working parents, and is asking whether that might make a difference. But you were fairly pessimistic as to the future gains that could be made in parental employment. So I wondered if you could start by talking us through that.
Yeah, so first of all, I think the expanded childcare offer is included in the OBR baseline for what we compare. So in the scenario of poverty rising a lot in our baseline, that includes that. They did score that how much they predict the impact will be on parental employment of that expanded childcare offer. I can't remember the numbers now. It's not quite enough to have a meaningful impact on child poverty, but it does make some difference. I think there's still places you can go with childcare, especially in provision, and especially for school-aged children. There's a chart in the report that shows of parents who are not working, the reasons why they're not working, and there is still a small but substantial amount who are not working because they're looking after children or they have childcare responsibilities. So there's more you can do there. I think there's also more you can do on parental skills. There's a large chunk of parents who are out of work for health reasons, so getting parents healthy enough to re-enter the labour market is key. So yeah, our optimistic assumption would kind of involve doing a range of these things. We think that you could kind of get to a sort of a rise definitely over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, but it feels like a lot of the low-hanging fruit, the easy stuff might have been done already in terms of policy interventions that can get a large number of families into work quite quickly.
Thank you. And a lot of the things that Alex has said there that would help parental employment, I mean, it's reminding me of what you said at the beginning, Kerry, about ideally all departments would see child poverty as their problem, but all the things that Alex has said, whether it's skills, I mean, the good work agenda would be enormously helpful to low-skilled parents who are trying to progress in the labour market. These are all things that a government would want to do anyway. If we can just link that to the child poverty agenda, maybe. But you were going to come in a minute.
Yes, just in relation to childcare, so it feels this with my sort of childcare hat on, and early years hat on. Although it's, as you say, it's childcare sort of that you need, throughout childhood. It feels like there is quite a lot of room to kind of improve this. Well, to fund, but also to improve the system. It is so complex for families well, for all families, but it's particularly complex if you're trying to kind of claim your childcare costs, the interface with the way the kind of providers work. And I feel like there is a kind of an agenda there that the Department for Education are very focused on, and there's potential for it to make a greater contribution to enabling parents, as you say, Mike, to kind of take the stepping stones into work. So, how do we think a bit more imaginatively about enabling parents to train, to reskill, to combine work and benefit support? And while obviously we want to increase the amount of employment that parents are able to enter into, there's also something about what is a kind of good balance. Have we got the hours kind of right here? As we think ahead about what a modern labour market might look like, we might want, I think there are more possibilities. And it just reminded me also of thinking about so often, it's a slightly separate point, but so often social security is thought about as, and it is about protection and security and what happens when things go wrong. But it is also about, and your example, Aaron, of Lucy, it is also about a kind of a springboard and giving you enough of a buffer to be able to be active, to be able to search for alternative accommodation or work. So there's something about sort of rehabilitating what we mean by social security, and it's about security. And also I think about how we can be more imaginative about the ways in which we want people to be able to combine work, but will need extra support to be able to increase their skills and employability.
Do you mind if I just say something?
Of course, Aaron.
So I think just wanted to reiterate one of the things that came through really strongly is that when we spoke to many of these families, they're really keen to try and retrain in a variety of different ways. But they find it really difficult. And I think one of the things that's happened over this period is kind of cuts to further education budgets. That I think if we think hard about some of the conversations about growth and industrial strategy, I think it does mean providing opportunities for some of these people who really do want to move into the work in the future, opportunities to retrain into some of these areas. And I just want to kind of reiterate that people talk very explicitly. They have very clear goals about what they would like to do in the future. And my sense is that some of that's malleable, right? If we provide different opportunities, people will move into those. I just wanted to touch on that because I think it's really true.
Thank you, great. We'll do some questions from the audience again. Oh, Lalitha's vanished with the microphone. Oh, there she's at the back, sorry. Sorry, Lalitha. We'll take this lady in the front row and then that lady in the front row, and we'll see where we go from there. Sorry to those of you not in the front row. There's got to be a reward sitting in the front.
Thank you. My name's Grace Duffy. I'm from Bridges Outcomes Partnerships. I wanted to pick up on, Kerry, your reflections about the fact, the easiest levers to pull previously, those of cash transfers, which, despite how strong these arguments are, and I'm very supportive of your recommendations, don't seem very likely to be pulled in the near future. And it got me thinking about, surely there are opportunities for thinking about systemic reform. There are a lot of services which are currently underperforming in terms of providing that support to families, to parents. So I wonder what the panel's views were about, which are those services which are most underperforming, and the extent to which, there is an opportunity for increasing the efficacy of this support, bringing those services together, making them more, holistic and, family-centred. Surely there is more that we can do there, partnering with the VCSE, with private sector. So what the opportunities are for doing more with what we already have.
Okay, thank you. And that's a good reminded me that we should have said that the government has said there's 4 themes to its child poverty strategy, and we focused on 1.5 of them. So the government's 4 themes are incomes, essential costs, and we looked at housing, financial resilience, we haven't looked at that, and I think the final one is local services, which we haven't tried to look at all, but thank you for the question. We'll take your question.
Thank you. My name is Marvi Memon. I'm the former Social Protection Minister from Pakistan. I'm also on the World Bank Advisory Council for Partnership for Economic Inclusion, and the current cap hat, which is completely relevant to this, is that I'm the president of the Legislative Alliance for Women Empowerment Protection, which does model legislation through Gen AI. My question to you is, you were discussing other countries. Right at the beginning, you started your presentation, and with the fact that you are just at the bottom, but you've got 5 others. It was quite a surprise to me, but since I'd seen the report, that is the perspective I'm coming from. What learnings have you taken from other countries who are also struggling with the same problem? Because through Gen AI, we are managing the extraction, the analysis, and then going into legislation super fast. Without Gen AI, we couldn't have even done it. So are you building, are you thinking along those lines? Of course, when you do your report, do you have access to that? Because we'd like to work with you if you don't.
Okay, thank you. We'll take one more. We'll go front row prerogative again. Sorry, not
Sit
sorry.
next time.
Flo from the Civil Service, and I just wondered, it kind of touches on the Dell AME stuff, but also local authority spending, and whether the structure that we actually allocate spend on child poverty is wrong, particularly given it is a regional issue in the UK.
Yeah, it is, and I know that the civil servants are grappling with the issue of how do you come up with the child poverty strategy in the context of a spending review, which is supposed to be setting Dell spending, in other words, spending for departments, and isn't supposed to be thinking about AME spending, which is all the stuff DWP control. Okay, we've got lots of questions. Kerry, do you want to start?
It's a very good question, Grace, is it?
Yeah.
Yes, a very good question and a very big question. So I would so housing feels to me we know it's crucially important. I'm not a housing expert, but it doesn't deliver quickly. But thinking about housing through the lens of thinking about child poverty feels like it would be a useful exercise. And so obviously there's a question of costs. I mean, also that in terms of private rental sector, there are really also major issues in relation to quality. So quality of housing was less of an issue in the previous child poverty strategy, was it less, or certainly not seen through that lens. So there's just something that feels really important to think about both of these things together. We also know in terms of children's social care that there's a really important sort of relationship between the wider socioeconomic circumstances and then also issues of how we protect children and think about the way those social services work. So I'm not going to try to answer, but just to say I think it's worth our while spending time on and thinking about. In relation to local spending, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's changed greatly, both in terms of devolution at nation level, but also devolution in terms of thinking about combined authorities and local authorities. And while the earlier child poverty strategy did have a local government kind of lens, I think there's much more we could do in terms of thinking about what that would mean in terms of distribution of money, but also different ways of working across services. So there is a nerdy bit around how we get data working together and thinking about children and families and around understanding what's going on with parents' needs so that we can also anticipate what's going on with children's needs. And I think there's some real gains to be had, but those are not quick wins.
Thanks. Alex, do you want to address any of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think the localisation point is really interesting. We're doing some more work on that this year, looking at the social security system as a whole. Obviously, we look at a bit in the report at devolved policies, especially what Scotland's done. But I think there is a space to look into how local authorities, the budgets that they have to deal with discretionary support and how that's administered. I think a lot of the time at the moment, discretionary funds are being used to kind of put out fires created by the mainstream system, with things like cuts to housing support where people end up in these crisis situations. Local authority money is being used to sort of paper over those cracks. So it's probably not living up to its potential of using that kind of localized knowledge and localized differences in outcomes, like you say. So yeah, I think there's definitely a conversation there. And I think in the international point, there is work obviously that looks at child poverty in an international comparison. We only touched on it in our report, but I think there's definitely learnings from other countries. We looked at a little bit at the 2-child limit. aren't any other countries in Europe that have a 2-child limit. There is some Southern European countries that limit support for families that are larger than that. I think 4 children plus in Spain. But yeah, we're currently the only country that does that. We don't use any generative AI for our modelling. I'm a bit of a Luddite with that stuff at the moment, but I'm interested to chat.
Thanks. Aaron, do you want to add anything, or we could move on?
Maybe just one small point, which is that not just the 2-child limit, but the benefit cap is also unique among other countries. Yeah. There's, I think, maybe one other country that does something a little bit similar, but it's unusual. So we're a bit of an outlier on both dimensions.
Okay, thank you. I want to look at Scotland for a bit. John Dickey, who is someone who works at CPAG Scotland, I happen to know, has asked a question online. Hi, John, up in Scotland at the moment. I think I was really surprised by the two facts we have in our report. The first one was on the discrepancy between forecast poverty rates between Scotland and England, and the second one was this the fact that the package that you set out for the UK is only really proportional to what they're already committed to in Scotland. Sorry, I basically said you're too fat. Not leaving much for you to say other than that. Yes, well remembered, Mike.
Yeah, well remembered, Mike. Scotland have put a lot of investment into the Scottish Child Payment and are now promising to mitigate the 2-child limit, which comes into our modelling. We show in the report that child poverty in England is projected to rise by 3% over the Parliament, and child poverty in Scotland is projected to fall by about 2%. And there's already a discrepancy in where we're starting from. I think child poverty in Scotland is about 24% compared to 30% in England. So yeah, they're going a different way at the moment. And the lessons are that investment in that kind of income support seems to be working.
Yeah. And of course, the mitigation of the 2-child limit hasn't yet happened, but they said they want to do it. The consultation has just gone out on how they might do it. There are definitely some flaws. They can't do it perfectly, and so on and so on. But if they do go through with it, then it would be a major difference between the two countries. Aaron, anything?
Yeah, I mean, I need to say that there is some work that's starting to come out that's talking to families that are affected by that, done by Ruth Patrick, Kitty Stewart, Emily Tominay, and others. And I think the early indications are that this is actually being felt on the ground as well. So I think that the numbers that you're showing and kind of modelling are pointing in the same direction of the kind of lived experience of people living under these different regimes at the moment. And I guess that's heartening because it shows us that not only can you make different policy choices, but that those policy choices are felt, and that's important too.
And then maybe to link it back to some of the New Labour experience, and Kerry, you were talking about what made a difference under New Labour. Probably what made the difference in New Labour, as well as in Scotland, is political commitment at the very, very top. It's all very well having strategy. It's all very well having targets, and in 2010 the Labour government passed the Child Poverty Act, which set out targets, which were then just completely ignored by the following governments. But surely, what Scotland and New Labour both tell us is the political commitment at the very top that is going to make the difference ultimately.
Yes, absolutely. So both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were very focused on it. I mean, Blair made his big pledge. He was more interested probably in the kind of services, education kind of end of that, and Gordon Brown was always a huge sort of champion of the kind of thinking about the income and the finance and obviously the development of all the tax credits. But that sort of commitment together, and also the fact that it also creates a kind of competition a bit between two most prominent people in the government at the time. So obviously we have, and we'll see how that kind of plays out in the current context. It's just that it's a very different economic context. So obviously the sort of the argument was different. But yes, political and of course, and we do see that in Scotland, and they've been very persistent in terms of developing their measures. And it will be very interesting to see, it's both really important because we can see, as you were saying, Aaron, that if it seems to be sort of filtering down, people are feeling the difference, and that's the potential, I guess, for the devolved nations to be able to kind of put pressure also on Westminster, that there are different ways of doing things.
So Scotland is a model of what can be done if you throw resources at it. Let's go the other way, and let's return to perhaps what Carrie was touching on. What do we think the government should do if there isn't the money to splurge on this? We do have a poll on this as well, which is basically what would be the next best thing they could do other than the 2-child limit. I think probably some of these are also quite expensive as well. But if the government were to rule out the 2-child limit on the grounds of the cost, where do you think the government should focus its effort to have the biggest impact on reducing child poverty? I'm going to come to the panel, really, who can either answer that question or answer the question to Carrie you posed at the very beginning, which is, if there really isn't much money to go around at all, should it focus on destitution? Should it focus on sorting out services for the most disadvantaged families, or should it just do whatever it can to increase family incomes? Aaron, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll take on the difficult question.
Yep.
On the list, I think I'd probably go for increases to social security benefits. That's maybe not cheap, but I think.
But that's like if you won't do a 2-child limit for whatever reason, just any money will do.
Yeah,
get money into
it. Maybe goes back to the point that you were making around, if it's politically unpopular, you're
Yeah.
worried about some sort of fallout as a result of doing that. It might be that this would be another option that you could pursue, and I guess you could scale it to meet some target that you have in terms of actual spare resources. And obviously some of these others would be great as well. But I think I'd probably go down that road. Yeah, in terms of smaller things, I don't want to be a broken record, but I would really prioritise the benefit cap. I think in terms of its impact on pushing people into really difficult situations at the very bottom, that would be, I think, it would make a real difference to those families. And as I've tried to lay out, I don't think it's having some of these really large impacts that the government were hoping would play out, and so it just seems to be making lives very difficult for people at the very bottom, and it touches on this question of destitution. How that's defined in this context, but these are very low-income families who are in very difficult situations. So, and doing that would be much cheaper than addressing the 2-child limit.
Yeah. And we did focus in our report on 60% of median income as the main indicator, basically following what the government has said. But the government did also say that it did want to come up with measures of that were targeting children at the very bottom end as well. That's right. I did right in that.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. And then what's your answer to this question, Alex?
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. I think if you are ruling out the 2-child limit or big investment in boosting income support, you might not be looking at a situation where you can move hundreds of thousands of children above the poverty line, but then it's looking at what's the most good that you can do, and maybe it's good to look at those who are struggling the most, those who are right at the bottom. Some of those, and looking at some of those caps like the benefit cap or the local housing allowance freeze, could be the best way to go forward. I think we make a point in the report. I think you've mentioned it already, but about we focused on incomes, partly because that's what the government's likely to do in its strategy, but partly because we think that increasing incomes are very important, especially in the society that we live in now. Incomes are very, very important for families' quality of life. You can have all the other things are great to kind of build on top of that, but we're not in a society where there are these really good services where families can sort of rely on them to smooth over all the difficult situations that they go through. Living in the UK in the 21st century, you really need adequate incomes to have a kind of meaningful quality of life. For that reason, I would choose increasing social security benefits. Just whatever money that you've got, try and channel that towards families in poverty or families in really deep poverty. Seems like the most effective thing that you could do.
Okay, Carrie?
I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
I think given what's going on in relation to severe poverty, it would make sense to do that. I think it still is worth thinking about in relation to parental employment. Well, there are things that we might try and test out for the parents who are economically inactive or who are only working a small number of hours. how can we support that sort of reskilling or stepping stones into work. But in terms of where to put the money, if it's less money, I would do the same.
And I'm sure the kind of tough choices again are being thought about in DWP, right? I mean, well, we know that DWP has been put under lots of pressure to save money at the moment, principally in the area of disability benefits. I mean, if the government were to come out with a package of cutting disability benefits in order to increase family benefits, would we be? I know. No. What would we think?
Sorry, Alex. There's the very difficult question.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, I'm sure those are the kind of trade-offs and choices going around DWP at the Treasury at the moment. Reminding us of the difficult fiscal environment. Let's see everyone else's answer to this question. What do you think? Okay. We are very fond of cash going to families with children, which is absolutely fair enough. I wanted to end by thinking about going back to this public attitude, public approach to child poverty. I mean, this is in opposition, all the Prime Minister and Chancellor talked about was growth. And all we've been talking about is getting some of that growth to low-income families with children. You'd think that they're really not that very far away. An anti-child poverty strategy should be very closely aligned to a growth strategy. And we've talked already how that some of the things that parents say they need in order to progress in the labour market, they're things that you need to do in order to get growth. They're things you need to do in order to get an 80% employment target. I just slightly feel there's a bit of a disconnect between child poverty seen as this, I don't know, thing over there where it engross their main missions. Interested whether the panel agree with that and whether there's anything they think we can do, or the sector can do, or we all can do to just try and align child poverty with the government's growth mission. Kerry.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. It doesn't feel that so the kind of the way in which child poverty is seen as and benefits are seen as a sort of drain on. I'm not saying the current government thinks that, but it's often perceived as a drain on the economy, as opposed to a platform and a way of supporting people to be economically active and so on. So I think there's more work to do in that territory, and how do we sort of change the terms of the conversation? So absolutely agree, and so people in the audience and out there, ideas very welcome.
Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think there's a number of areas where they do really overlap, as you've already said, Mike, and we do know some things about how this kind of redistribution can be quite good for growth in terms of increasing aggregate demand, which is not incommensurable with some of the goals that the government have. And so, while I think that there's an emphasis on trying to drive some of the kind of innovation that's going to enhance productivity, which is an incredibly important part of that conversation, I think there's also this other piece to it, which is perhaps missed, and the role that Social Security can play in supporting some of that move as well. And so I do think there are some alignments there, and I think that government might be able to find ways to bring those together in terms of a wider package and suite of reforms.
Yep. Yeah. I have nearly gone an entire event without mentioning Economy 2030, which was a 2.5-year project where we thought about a strategy for shared growth, and we were definitely all for productivity increasing investments, going big, more dynamism, more trade, more investment, more skills. But crucially, we did say that you have to do a lot more than that to make it a shared growth agenda, and critically was that thinking about the social security system. So I will use that to end on. Thank you all very much for listening. We'll just end by giving a round of applause to the panel.